Alright, another anti-bullshit man response video. The section. That's just your psychology, stupid. So apparently this has something to do with analyzing underlying motivations, maybe. The distinction between philosophy and psychology, and it's basically a critique of my argument that people are owned by their psychology, and that, you know, if they could obtain philosophical clarity, that context would temper that psychology sufficiently to have them understand, you know, that there's nothing about this. Well, there's nothing, but it's nothing but a lie anyway. I mean, I'm not gonna. It's like arguing the lie of religion. You know, I have said before that religious people are basically liars, right? They don't really believe in this God. They just believe in the usefulness of the religion. For the most part, 99% of religious people, you can see they don't really conduct their life as if they believed in this God. I mean, clearly, if you believe the God exists, it seems to me pretty clear, and you believe that He had the keys to heaven and hell, and you were going to go to one of these places, you'd be pretty certain that you'd read that book a few times. And most religious people haven't read it once. You know, so come on. So you know, just this. I just don't see any point in this argument. The way he argued it is just pretty insulting. And okay, so you took some shots at me because I did this and I did that, and I said this and I said that, and I'm not allowed to critique other people's motives or their intentions or their psychology. Least I'd be subject to you doing it to me, so to speak, I guess. Fine, whatever. The difference is I'm right and they're wrong. And when people are wrong, it's likely going to be because this isn't that complicated. To tell you the fucking truth, anti-bullshit man. It isn't that life isn't that complicated. It's a replicating molecule in a material universe that is obviously run by ignorant forces. It really isn't that complicated a story. And so for them to make it complicated, yeah, it's psychology that's making that happen. Alright, because it's not a very demanding physical truth. It's not a very demanding material truth. It's not trigonometry or complex equations or even a complex verbiage in terms of language. It's a frickin' Three Bear story. Okay, the truth of our existence. We're just monkeys. And before that we were slumping monkeys. And before that we were, yeah, fucking bugs. So all this bullshit is just that. It's just a bunch of psychology that has people thinking, you know, and it's a very fake religion in the sense that this religion of pro-lifery is bullshit. They don't have any respect for life on this planet. They don't like the average person. This even came up in the tiny chat thing, and yeah, sorry, I lost the. I didn't realize I had I have to convert the MP3, and I didn't realize I had the settings to limit to 5 hours, and so that was really dumb. So I cut off the last 2 hours, which were really good. So if anybody has a recording, you know, an audio recording or any kind of recording of last week's tiny chat, I would appreciate it. But yeah, it's probably lost forever. But yeah, I deleted the file before I realized, you know, somebody pointed out that it cuts off. So that's really, it's just disappointing because those are really amazing. You know, that was a really, you know, it was a pretty bizarre conversation. So I really am disappointed that that's lost. But anyway, I might have even wanted to listen to it again. So the argument here is that anti-bullshit man is making, especially towards the end here, is, you know, Inmendham has shown that he understands how reverse psychology can play a vital role in many Democrat blah 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 blah. As it is clear that he must also know that the same reverse psychology is susceptible to the recruitment of psychological, whatever that is. I don't know why he has to use certain words here that are just like putatively. I mean, instead of assumption or supposedly, maybe that's another word for supposedly, depressing outlook. So he says, for a supposedly depressing outlook, that's one hell of a high pedestal. So he's always implying my own aggrandizement and all this other kind of crap, and it's valiant thinker, he's putting these words in my mouth, and just really insulting, and, whatever, knock yourself out. So his accusation is that the people who gravitate to this philosophy do so because they're depressed over having flat feet or something, and so have decided to get mad at the entire universe because they have flat feet. Or they have demonstrated themselves to be colossal failures in playing the game, so then they rather just believe the game is rigged because that makes them feel better. Or some other psycho-babble bullshit. And that's okay. It's a fair argument to make, but you ought to make it specifically to individuals, and then those individuals can account for themselves. And that's how I make the accusation, generally speaking. I'm making it to somebody and saying, okay, you're accepting the existence of evolution, you're accepting the existence of no God, and yet you're telling me there's some sort of built-in function. So I have to assume there's some sort of psychological mechanism in you that says blah, blah, blah. And you can always break it down, and you'll get an answer like the guy in Tiny Chat basically said, I want to have a kid because I have a big fucking ego. He thinks his kid's going to turn out like him. That's what he thinks is going to happen. He couldn't give me a name of somebody else he wants his kid to be like. Besides him. So it's just fucking pure ego trip. And that's, but I think I've done enough. I've done enough videos on this line between psychology and philosophy, and I just don't think this critique is at all fair in terms of all those videos I have done, pointing out the dangers of this blending of the two and all this other stuff. But I've also pointed out there's no way to avoid it in some respects. There's no way to avoid having both of your, we're not Mr. Spock. We don't have a switch where you just turn it off. So you're going to emotionally react to what you philosophically understand, what you intellectually deduce is going to affect you emotionally. It's any kind of knowledge you gained, through any insight gained. If you've learned some physical facts about some circumstantial thing, even knowledge of death is psychologically influential. It changes us. Knowing that we're going to die changes us psychologically. Anyway, so he ends with this one. They're depressed for different reasons. Their grasp of ugly truth has nothing to do with it. Truth is not ugly, nor is it emotionally unsettling, nor is it depressing, for psychology is indeed not philosophy. So basically stated in this sentence is that we're not informed by our psychology, and we are. And there's going to be some, the agenda, again, we're back to this word agenda, but yeah, the presuppositions, some of them are going to be established by psychology, and it's like me programming a computer or something. The computer can do just static computation, so yeah, it can be very logical, but the agenda, the work that it's going to do is created by my initiative, and my initiative is created by my capacity to be harmed and pleased, and that's just a fact. You can't change the fact that that's the agenda setter. The point is where it biases you. Okay, not that acknowledging the existence of our sentience is not a violation of the rules. Acknowledging that psychology, in some respects, establishes what is valuable. I mean, what falls into the categories of pain and pleasure. These two different concepts are established by that psychology, and reliably so. I mean, they can be consistently defined that way across all kinds of different feeling things. the sensations are consistent, and they're usually biologically structured in the sense that the ones that are physical harms to the body obviously have a negative impact, generally speaking, on our psychology. But that is the agenda setter, ultimately, and logically we can understand that that's perfectly sensible, because yes, we experience this psychological manifestation of a feeling, and it can be a completely obnoxious and revolting feeling, and we're just logically can acknowledge that's the price we're paying, that's the thing happening. We can acknowledge the mechanisms here, that there is this mechanism of desire, and that it's quite different than the mechanism of fear. Just like pain is different than pleasure, they're not opposites of each other, they're different things. These are different things. And the one that's going to have more tendency to be a bias is the one that has no correlation to anything real. Our fears are always usually tied to some fear of something being harmed, either ourselves or something we care about, or something we put place value in. And our desires, though, are this vacuous hunger established by the biological mechanism that has no correlation to some sort of realistic understanding that, there's no positive correlation to the emotion of empathy, let's say. There's no positive example of an empathy. Yeah, I don't think so anyway. I guess you could say that avarice or jealousy, but it's a decidedly negative emotion, not a positive one. So again, I don't think that could be established as an inverse of empathy. It's a negative emotion. And it would have to be a positive one to be oppositely correlated. Well, anyway, I don't want to. Like I said, I have made enough videos on this subject of psychology and philosophy, and the truth is simple, and I don't think there is really any way it can't totally fuck a psychology to recognize that the game it's playing is futile, that the fundamental nature of your competitiveness is destructive, that there's no fair fight, which is also destructive to your sense of alpha pride and all that kind of crap. The game is rigged, your victories are going to be shallow, and your defeats are going to be hard, and there's just no way to play it. There's no way for an intelligence to go into this insanely stupid game. And it's basically a gladiator war. It basically is the Christians being fed to the lion thing. It is the Colosseum. And you're saying that a sensible, informed psychology, and a psychology that has a brain telling it, giving it information about what statistically is happening in front of it, could have a good time at the Colosseum. That it shouldn't psychologically have a problem with what it was witnessing. And I think the person would have to be really quite sociopathic. They would have to be too disconnected from any kind of rational understanding of the nature of their equality with other people, the nature of their vulnerability, in the sense that it could be me getting eaten by that lion. All of those things should have profound psychological impact. That knowledge should inform me that I'm in big trouble as I sit in the stands watching this. That should thoroughly inform my psychology that I'm not in a good circumstance, that this is not a good thing that's happening in front of me. And if my psychology isn't reacting, then somehow I'm not being informed properly, because the threat is through every bit of your being, in a sense. Every notion of any conceivable, desirable end is tainted by a counter image. It's like if you knew, let's say, you're horny for sex, let's say, okay, and you found out that, boobs or vaginas, they carried some sort of heart disease or something. That thought, or just if you knew a particular woman and you said, wow, she's really hot, but you knew she had something, that understanding of that disease would be enough to psychologically totally unravel your desire for that person. It's gonna, cut it down at least quite a bit. Yeah, it's gonna make it a lot less attractive, however you want to describe it. It's gonna change your psychological reaction, that little bit of knowledge of the risk that's attached to it, and your vision of what the consequences of losing in the venereal disease game might mean. So anyway, but yeah, I don't want to get into this whole. I just don't, whatever. You want to make the accusation, then make a direct accusation. But these are all just such indirect accusations, just generally saying that, okay, people who are have been tempered by experience to realize the gravity of the game we're playing, and then also realize that gravity, that the having had the personal experience with pain and suffering, that informs them, their depression or their problems in life, and that information is just clearly just a bias. I think that's just nonsense. It's not a bias. It can be purely informative, and it can make them capable of understanding that there's way too much at stake, and the gain is too small, and all. It can lend evidence to proportionality. And that is sort of going to be part of the psychology is going to have to be involved in it anyway, to some degree. And I guess the point is to allow the psychology to be involved in some way that's not biasing. So the bias would be to say that, let's say if I had very, just because I was lucky, I could have a headache, and the headache is just tiny, a little tiny headache. But we're using the same word for somebody else's headache that's massive. And if I had no appreciation of that difference, or the fact that difference exists, then I'm not gonna understand the weight or the gravity of things. So I guess I don't know. I'm just saying that weight is going to have to be established kind of through the experience of psychology. It's like if you made an intelligent computer, it would still have to have some taste of sentience. It'd have to know what it is in some way to be able to understand it. It would have to be able to taste it. It would have to be able to. You'd have to give it some. It'd be very hard to do it in some sort of abstract logic to explain what it is to feel bad without ever feeling bad. You'd have to be able to say, no, it's 10 times worse than this, or it's 5 times worse than that. I mean, you'd have to have some this or that to compare it to. You'd have to have some taste of it to be able to manifest any kind of notion of what you're trying to say exists. I mean, you could establish it as a premise. The computer just say, okay, I'll just accept whatever you say as the value, and then I'll do my math. But I mean, for it to really recognize what's being evaluated, it would have to experience it. So anyway, But yeah, whatever. If you want to make the accusation that people who might find life difficult for some other reason besides understanding it might end up looking harder for an explanation of what life is and find the explanation wanting, which would in turn make their circumstance even worse. I don't think that's a wrong way of arriving at the truth. I don't think that means they've been biased into it because they start off with a depression that wasn't caused by a worldview. But it certainly could lead to acquiring a worldview because it gives you incentive to acquire a worldview. And I still wouldn't be able to say that I could ever find any reason why somebody would endure a hard depression if the simple solution was just to accept that the world is wonderful in the end. Because I think that would be a compensation enough. And clearly I think it would be for people who would understand any of these concepts of the interchangeability of the human players and the bias that exists in our own ego. And so if they can say those two, if they can make any kind of sensible, construct any sensible sentences showing any understanding of the concept of ego or the concept of fundamental equality, I think it'd be hard to make the accusation that they are choosing a negative worldview because somehow it gives them excuses. I think that's bullshit. So anyway, I thought it was a cheap rag, but all of this whole thing is just pretty much a cheap rag. So anyway, enough of this section. Whatever. I think there's obvious evidence of the positive bias, and I don't think there's much evidence at all. I don't even think you can acquire a negative enough. I don't think anybody on Earth, frankly, is negative enough to the proportions of negativity we should be outraged at the horrors. We should be totally ruined by what happens daily. And the very fact that we're not indicates that the bias even exists in the hardest of the depressed still can't resist the tendency to say, well, it ain't so bad where I am at this moment, and not appreciate that, yeah, it's a lot worse than you can even imagine. And recognizing that fact that it's worse than I can even imagine. I can't even imagine the shit that happens every fucking goddamn day. The horror. I can't do anything to even acknowledge the existence of it. The weight of it, the amount of it, the substance of it. And to say that there's any threat of the negative bias somehow perverting human philosophy when we can see so obviously how humans make things acceptable all the time, and there's very little energy to make something unacceptable. Yeah. So I just whatever. Fuck you. Yeah, this is just shitty argument. Sorry, this is just bullshit. It's just to argue the basic nature of the fundamental process that we're involved in. And if you want to make an accusation of a bias or a bigotry, then make it clear. This vague idea that somehow it exists, kind of, sort of, maybe. No, make it directly or shut up with it. It's just bullshit to just vaguely imply everybody's, upset because they lost the three-legged race when they were 7 years old, and they've been mad ever since, and so they curse the entire universe because they're pissed off because they lost a race. I mean, bullshit. Jeez. Or the inverse, where people are trying to compensate for their lack of a life by running to the let's manufacture a baby so we can protect ourselves, we can shield ourselves with it. Shield ourselves in a lot of ways in terms of having a failed life. It really is. I mean, for a lot of people, it. It's a way of automatically legitimizing your little whore slut life. Turn yourself into a mother. Yeah. Anyway. Till next subject.